Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. Norm and I strive to get together and create this podcast you listen to every week. On top of that, we do our best to try and make the content and production as professional as possible and keep it free to enjoy. This might lead someone to say we're committed to the listeners, yet if no one listened, we would still do it. So maybe we're just committed to good conversations with each other. Yet some weeks, we can't get together because we have more important or pressing commitments. So are we really committed to the show at all? If we are, how do we go about deciding how much of a priority to make it? Can a misjudgment on our part constitute an ethical violation? With so little time and so much to do in a world of ever-evolving relationships, how do we pin down commitment?
That's a really close to home, ground zero way to start. I like that.
Yeah, it is. Well, it's just kind of a funny thought experiment, right? You know,
it is.
I do get that a lot where people go, oh, you put a lot of thought and work into the show. And I don't think that's, it's not necessarily false. I don't think of it as work because I enjoy doing it. But you and I have been very candid in the past about the fact that if nobody listened, we'd still be here doing it. When we started doing it, we didn't know if anybody would ever listen.
Right.
And so we just love getting together and talking.
Yes.
But yeah, on weeks when we can't get together, right, we have other commitments.
But having multiple commitments commitment's not people won't like this. Commitment's not an all or nothing proposition. It's not a binary opposition. This wholly, no matter, nothing else. None of us has a commitment that supersedes all commitments all the time at every moment. Seemingly.
Right.
And yet, and I know we'll get more into this, but I don't think anyone would argue if they're in a committed relationship with another human being that relationship is ever secondary in importance to them in their hearts or minds. But sometimes other things are required because of work, or because of relationships with others to whom both are committed. It means, well, we can't spend as much time doing this as we want to. But that doesn't mean there's not a commitment. Commitment has this dual, a positive connotation and a negative connotation. And the interesting thing is that the negative connotation often applies to business, but the positive connotation often applies to causes or relationships. And so I think that's going to be worth talking about too.
Yeah. It's really interesting. And I think that it's good. It's a good hook for the conversation going forward, right? Because I think in some ways we do think about commitment as being black or white, as this binary thing. Either you're committed or you're not. And we do tend to mix up ethical and moral, ethics and morality into commitment, which also makes it sort of ambiguous. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach this time. Rather than jumping right into the formative stuff, we're going to try to delineate some concepts, right? So what is the difference between a promise and a commitment?
Well, at the start, we were joking before the show that we essentially take an idea, we say, "Oh, this idea, nope. Here's why it doesn't work." They have a relationship, but the idea of commitment implies often, in contexts, how it's used, as longer term or wider in scope.
Yeah, what I had down in my little notes was, that a promise tends to be explicit and it tends to be situational, right? So And of course, this is just me going off of, sort of anecdotal analysis of the two terms. But yeah, it seems like, commitment tends to be implicit, right? You don't generally, other than something like marriage, or commitment tends to just be something that's in the background, right? We get together every week and do the podcast because we're committed to good conversations. We're committed to providing listeners access to them.
Yeah.
But we don't really explicitly talk about that commitment other than in that monologue and right now. But otherwise, it's just in the background.
Right.
And I think that as far as a situational, right, that can go both ways, right? Because as the intro monologue stated, commitment is situational, right? We have other situations in our lives which cause us to prioritize commitments.
Yeah.
Whereas a promise seems to transcend that a little bit. If you make a promise, it's generally sort of assumed that you're going to keep that promise regardless of what situations arise, right? If you're making a promise, you're saying, I'm going to do this thing,
a particular thing.
Right.
And often not a thing that lasts across space and time.
Yeah, there's an end to it.
There is. I promise to work on a vehicle with my brother. It's lasting longer in space and time than I intended.
It's becoming a commitment.
He did, but it's becoming a commitment. But ultimately, it is measurable in really hours or months with the actual time on it. And then it's done. It's accomplished. A commitment is more ideal in the sense that you are dedicated to an engagement with something lasting. And that doesn't mean it lasts forever. It just means that it's what we'll get into the business terms. There's a whole lot of subcategories for types of commitment in business circumstances. But the idea that you are engaged and have accepted an obligation to, because you wanted to, toward a mission of some kind. And that tends to be more sweeping, or you are dedicated to an idea. Abraham Lincoln comes to mind just saying that in rough terms. Dedicated to the proposition that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a really good lead into my next term, which is there a difference between duty and commitment?
I think yes, don't you?
I think so, yes.
Because, well, you accepted the commitment of the military at eyes wide open, weighing the alternatives. You've talked about that. And therefore you accrued duties. It's kind of a transactional thing. Although I don't think it's equally transactional sometimes for the military, but to me, it seems somewhat transactional. I accept the duties that go along with enlisting, even though they're duties I hope I never have to fulfill. But eyes wide open, we accept that. Most things are transactional in the sense of duty. If I am hired to do work, hired at a community college, there was a whole bullet point list of duties and things that would be understood that I would undertake, and then a whole lot of other ones that emerged after that because of the nature of evolving education, evolving itself. But there's still an underlying duty that I've accepted, a duty to do the best one can to educate students. And that's not for 2 weeks, and it's not for 2 years. It's for however long you are doing the work. It's not like, the duty goes away after a while. No. So duty is always there.
So do you think duty is an emergent property of commitment then? Do you think you commit to something and then you have duties that come from it, or is it a standalone proposition?
I know I like the idea that it's emergent, because you might not know all the duties that things happen. You accept, or the duty part is you'll do it even though that's not what you signed on for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this creates an interesting sort of issue. So if we sort of contrast a promise and a duty, right?
Yeah.
I think that a promise is almost always volitional, right? Nobody can make you promise to do something. You have to volunteer to say, I promise I will do something. But promises tend to be more limited in scope, more limited in time, very situational, very explicit. Whereas duty tends to be an emergent property of a commitment that's made. It may not be voluntary, right? You may not have any say in it. So if we sort of tie these back to the concept of commitment, is commitment, do you have to volunteer? Do you have to be volitional in your commitment, or can commitment be imposed upon you the way a duty can?
It's a fascinating question, because I was thinking about the idea that you just said a moment ago, that promise is something you're not forced to do. But there are circumstances in which people, these are grim circumstances, but they are forced to make a promise in order to get a family member back. Kidnappings and ransomings are not unknown around the planet. And I know it seems an extreme example, but it happens an awful lot.
Is there another term for it, or did you think promise?
Well, okay, so I'm going to go to the absolutely silly for a moment, but pop culture helps to ease our way in. I watched a bit of an old Mission Impossible movie last night. I didn't stay with it. I was just wanting to sample. I wanted to see how the beginnings of the movies changed over years. It was just a silly exploration. But there's one in which the Tom Cruise character is in an impossible situation, of course, with someone he cares about who has a gun pointed to the head situation, literally, and tries in the matter of seconds to cycle through all kinds of ways to negotiate with the person who is threatening the third party, and finally says, I promise that I will find whatever it is that you need. And of course, the villain is too much a villain to even accept that. But it was interesting to me. I didn't expect to stumble onto this, but there was the idea of promise, and the character's clearly committed to the person who's under threat. The character will do anything to try to get that threat to go away, including compromising himself with the promise that, knowing the character, he would keep, even though it would put a dent in his own ethics. So I think that we don't generally think of that as a promise. And I know I've gone off the track of the question that you asked, but I think that a promise is mostly volitional. And I think you're right that the duty sometimes isn't. I mean, I think about the idea of well, it's much on my mind these days, and it's all of us. I think any of us who has a parent, or has a parent who's no longer with us, or parents who are, or both, or neither, there's still this notion of duty to dad or mom, or even if there were relationships that were really not comfortable, I think people as adult children of another being wrestle with the duties that somehow were implied by that being, even though they don't always work, and we push back and say, nope, that's not mine. But the very fact that we have to wrestle, I think, indicates that this duty thing is there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So no, that was a really good, actually was a really good answer to it. And what it demonstrated is that, okay, so promises and duties can both sort of be against our will, which kind of implies that even though commitment is a separate concept, it probably falls under the same rules, right? If you think about like conscripted soldiers, right? You mentioned me being in the military. Well, the U.S. military is voluntary, right? So I volunteered to join, but that's not the way it is in every military, right? So in some, you get conscripted, you get told, hey, you're going to be in the military, and then you have a commitment, you have duty to do something against your will, right?
Right. And these things change. They are shifting in a culture. In my lifetime, I remember Vietnam as a concept as the historical thing that was happening that I only saw news flashes of. But I was as a 12, 13-year-old petrified, because we see so much war, the ideological, yes, combat and war, and it's terrific, and John Wayne stuff. But then Dan Rather and the actual news footage of what was going on, there was an ideological clash, and that was good for our culture, even though it created all kinds of rifts. But a culture will shift over time, and it will tell implicitly or explicitly people, you have a duty. For a while, you're a male. Hey, you're a boy in the culture of the United States. You have a duty to be drafted. You have a duty to put your name on a piece of paper so that you can be. Well, I believe you still have to sign up when you're 18 to register. But as you say, it's all voluntary. That's a big shift. It was an important shift. And it has consequences in all kinds of directions. But a duty is not something that one. I think a duty is when it's imposed from the outside is much different than a commitment volitionally realized.
Yeah, there seems to be like a structural element to duty. Like it doesn't seem, you can offer a promise on an individual level and you can be committed on an individual level. But duty, I think, comes from an organizational, hierarchical sort of emergence from commitment. So, all right. So this has been a good overview. I'm hoping that the hooks are set for the listeners now. They're saying, all right, well, now I'm interested.
Yeah, I like the way you've approached it.
Let's look at some of the formative, questions. Have philosophers discussed commitment?
Oh, much. Then, middle years, now, whatever chronological or temporal approach we take with it. It accrued its more negative notions as a word etymologically. Back to the 1600s again. So much happens with language in the 1600s, edging into the 1700s. So the idea of commitment gained or developed the secondary thing, an action of officially consigning something to the custody of the state. I commit you to this situation. It's when entities began formally to in writing to remove people from circumstances and put them in other circumstances. Now, the removal of people from one circumstance, putting them in another, certainly happened way before that. But the formalization of that, so it meant both pledging oneself to something, but it also was when, like, I commit you to prison, or I commit you to an asylum, or that's that exterior, non-volitional idea of commit, which means the state, whatever government, whatever we mean by the state across time, the state will create rules by which it will impose commitment upon you. And that's partly where there's the connection to a draft.
Yeah.
But you asked about others, so we'll keep going. There's so many philosophers. We'll start with Socrates. No, let's start with Kierkegaard. We don't have to go in order. Kierkegaard said that commitment, but Kierkegaard was of this sort, unconditional commitment, forms your identity. Now, I think we would need to take apart, what do you think about the term unconditional commitment?
Yeah, this is interesting, right? Because I think that I want to say that there's something to it. And I'll tell you why. I think in many cases, there is, if you keep peeling away at somebody like layers of an onion, right? I think on the outside, you get sort of what we were talking about in the monologue to the episode, right? Are we committed to the listeners? Yes, in some fashion.
Mm-hmm.
But we're more committed to having good conversations.
Yeah.
But we can also be more committed to our families or to certain situations that arise. If there's a funeral we're attending or a graduation or whatever the case may be on a specific Saturday, we might have more commitment to that one-off situational thing than to having a good conversation that week. I think if you keep regressing back further and further, right, eventually you get to the quote unquote core values of the person, right?
Yeah.
What they're committed to. And I've talked about it on this podcast and other podcasts, right? If I can bring it back to one core commitment for myself, right? Which is the commitment to change, being willing to change my mind, my opinions, because change to me is an embodiment of growth, of living, right? Of living a life, right? So there is a commitment there that I would say that's a sort of an unconditional commitment, right? I'm unconditionally committed to the perception of myself as somebody who is open to changing, right?
For the duration of your life.
Right. Now, I think, I wouldn't go so far as to say that everybody could explicitly bring it back to that point, but I don't think that necessarily means that it doesn't exist for any given person. Right?
Yeah, you're not talking about having been born with this.
Right.
You're
right.
talking about having achieved a level of consciousness, whenever that happens, of this particular thing which drives you, is interesting to you, is part of your core. And people say an unconditional commitment will last a lifetime. Well, that sounds really fine, but it's true also that unconditional commitments aren't necessarily all attainable.
Right. I think that here's where it's good. It's interesting, right? Because unconditional opens itself up to infinite possibilities, right? And anytime you have infinities, things get really weird, right? Because
the Watcher says that in What If, and
right? Because
Marvel stuff.
Exactly. Like I could say, like, I am unconditionally committed to my wife, right?
Yeah.
But what if the second I said that, she goes around and she starts doing whatever she wants, right? Or she completely changes as a person? Do I still stick by an unconditional commitment if she's doing things to hurt me, or she has some sort of change that makes her an unrecognizable person to the one that I married? I think that obviously it's going to be situational dependent, but the fact that it's situational dependent doesn't make it unconditional, right? So I think unconditional commitment, right? You use that word that introduces the possibility that nothing can affect it, really severely diminishes the chances that it can exist in reality.
Yeah, it does. And you bring up the idea of marriage. I've seldom seen two people more committed to each other in healthy and growing ways than you and Amanda. But conceptually, one's spouse can change, and if certain things happen, those become conditions by which the current state might not continue in any relationship situation, marital or not. So you're right. They're almost it's impossible not to imagine conditions. However, there are people who adhere to the commitments, even to the detriment of themselves, or the people around them. An unconditional commitment can cause a human being to destroy himself, herself, if they remain so focused on it, because that would imply that there's no change that could possibly affect it. And I don't believe that. I mean, in legalistic terms, I'm not a lawyer, but it just there are people, or in religious terms, or spiritual terms, there are people who would say, no matter what, this relationship must continue. And if it gets really negative, well, that's just a test that you're being given to see whether or not you live up to your best self. I don't believe in that. I can't adhere to that. That doesn't make sense. But that doesn't mean you're not committed to what you hope is the best interest for that fellow human being. I think about my dad, and he's talked about this in public, so he wouldn't mind this. He was committed to my mother, so that even in dementia, he insisted that she not have to be moved from her home. Well, that's amazing, but it's not always or generally possible for people. And things in her diminishment were getting to the point where it wouldn't have been possible. But conditions changed such that she had hospice for a relatively small amount of time and then was gone. Had that not happened, we would not have been able to help make that good, to enable that condition to stay. So it was a fortuitous circumstance where the conditions met the commitment and sort of worked.
Yeah.
Death was a blessing. And so I would have thought nothing less of him and told him that if she had to be moved. And I'm not trying to dwell on this negatively, but I know an awful lot of people experience this. And there's so many social pressures from people to, no matter what, don't ever do this with your parent or that with your parent. And it's impossible, especially as people live longer. It's impossible to absolutely, unconditionally guarantee that you're going to be able to do that. And if you don't, then you start tearing yourself apart. So unconditional commitments can be negative too.
Yeah, you've taken us to the crux of another issue, right? Which is important. And this is what I was sort of getting at the tail end of our conversation on work last week, right? Is this idea of essentially how committed should you be, right? And on the work episode, we were sort of contrasting generations of workers, right?
Yeah.
Talking about how, okay, well, some of the older workers will say, hey, it's your duty, so have a stiff upper lip and you're getting paid and the job is essential. So get in there and do what you have to do, go 9 rounds and don't complain about it and put in your 40 years and then you can retire onto the couch and die. And then you have some, right? And then you have some younger people, right? Who are saying, well, I don't want to do this because it's hard and because it's not personally meaningful and, on and on and on. And what I was saying in that episode was that, neither position is healthy, right? When I was younger, I took the younger person's side, right? Now that I'm a little older, I can identify that there's legitimate concerns that are addressed by those younger people. But at the same time, sometimes we use as an easy out, just not caring, not having any commitment to anything, right? Just being able, and I think that's encapsulated well by work relationships, and it's encapsulated well by the idea of marriage and the idea of, that you and I just brought up, the examples we brought up there, right? So unconditional commitment, right? When you get married, if you are unconditionally committed, right? If I were to sit here and if Amanda, from the moment she woke up to the moment she went to sleep, just said nothing but "I hate you," except when she was stopping to take a gulp of water or eat some food, right? And I decided, well, I'm just going to stick with this for 40 years, right? Because we got married and that's what it is. That is obviously unhealthy and not something that I should remain committed to. But on the other hand, right?
For both people involved.
Right.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if, all of a sudden one day I decide that I don't really like the way it sounds when she chews, so I don't want to be married anymore, that's not really a great attitude to take either, right? Commitment and the emergent property of duties, right, sort of implies that, hey, you're going to have to do some work, right? You're going and doing those things, right? Being committed and fulfilling some duties is, in a very stoic way, right? Builds character, right? It makes you into a better person. So that leads me into the question, commitment spans the philosophical categories.
Yeah.
But is it ultimately a question of ethics or ontology, do you think?
I think more ontology than ethics. I say that because reminding that ontology has to do with being. Well, what is it to be? What is it to exist? And what exists and what does not, and those kind of things. Mm-hmm. They're not separate. Very few things in philosophy are just separate into these 6 major categories of philosophy that we started with years ago. But I think ontology supersedes ethics because how you are as a being and what you're doing in this world as a being, that comes before necessarily a bunch of rules and contracts. Which is where I think that idea of you were talking about of duty, the unconditional commitment. You have a duty to change. You've recognized that in yourself. I think if we look at the 3 components that business, have you read about these?
I don't think so.
The 3. So that in business commitment, there's the affective commitment, the continuance commitment, and the normative commitment. And the first, the affective refers to the employee's emotional attachments to or identification with and involvement in the organization. Now, you can't force an emotional attachment to an organization. It can grow. People can be invited in, or people can just be told they don't fit. But I think oddly that can apply to relationships too. People, especially if they get married young, and many people do. They don't know everything about the person that they're marrying. We never know everything about the person we're marrying, or the person that we choose to live with, even if we're not married. We come to know them. That's even though the W word, work, because we have to make everything sound. We're so work obsessed in this country that we talked about that last week. That even a relationship requires work. You said it a moment ago.
Yeah.
Well, but what do we mean by work? We mean attentiveness. Well, attentiveness doesn't have to be work.
Mm.
But all right, so the second one is the continuance commitment. Does an individual feel that they will lose more by leaving an organization than they would gain by staying with it? Well, that can be applied to a relationship as well. Do I stay with this? Well, if I'm starting to tote it up and look at the positives and negatives, that can sound really numerical and empirical and kind of cold, but it isn't. If you're saying, I want this relationship to work, what can I do to help it work? And if it doesn't work, then I'll quit. or somebody will tell me to quit. And the third that's often talked about in business is the normative, and And that is the sense of the obligation to stay, even though you might have better opportunities. And when I was reading about this, I thought of you, because oftentimes you have said quite upfront, I don't think this is not for public, because I think people know this about you. You could be working at a much bigger company, or in a much more urban setting, or in a place where the remuneration is significantly larger, but that it suits you to stay because you like the work, and it also allows you to balance with other things. And that's if that's an obligation, because if you're feeling forced to it, I don't think that's you. But if you're examining the sense of obligation, if you're unhappy in your role and you still stay because you have other obligations, that's not what you were talking about, but that's what some people do in their workplace, because they feel like they're getting enough from it to sustain a family. So these don't all work together.
Yeah. That is interesting. I didn't read about those, but now as you're listing them off, and I'm thinking about my experiences with business, I go, yeah, these are really applicable, right? And I think that does help you when you're considering generational differences or idiosyncratic differences with individuals, about how they view work and how they view specific companies, right? I think it's pretty accurate. I think it kind of does come down to those three factors in determining what their attitudes are towards a company and whether or not they stay. Right?
And I think that over time, I think it's always been true, but I think particularly in this moment in which we're living, companies, not to say yours, because I don't get that impression of yours, but there are companies. Google's been in the news the past few days as a glaring example of this. That negate or refuse to acknowledge any kind of agency of an individual working for them. No, you do not get to protest. You never get to protest. We do not allow that in our corporate culture. If you protest, even if you've expressed ideas of protest, even if you're associated with somebody who did, you'll be fired. And those kind of attitudes, those smack of McCarthyist 1950s.
Yeah.
You'll have whatever attitude we tell you to, and you'll keep your mouth shut about anything else. That's not going to grow a human being. That's not going to help the health of a corporate culture. And that would be, for me, a corporate culture being out of control and unaware of its own illness.
Yeah. And it goes even beyond corporate culture, because I was reading a while back about there are certain universities that make professors sign contracts up front that any inventions they might develop are property of the school, even if you develop on your own time outside of work or whatever. If you file a patent, it belongs to the school.
And it's not even that by itself. That's a horror in itself. But it's even down to the mundane level. I came to find out over the years where I was working that any materials that I developed, which is not the same thing as invention, any podcast I might have developed using school time or school materials or school equipment, so on, belong to the school. Any tape I made, any videotape I made, any lessons that I developed, technically, turns out they didn't want them. So but there are all these things that people don't even begin to think about when they become part of an organization. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned universities, and here's another idea of commitment that I think is totally worth exploring on this. And I'll even try to leave aside the specific political because it's bigger than that. If you go to a university and you've paid whatever is a chunk of change, an enormous amount in your life might be an enormous amount, or to anybody would be an enormous amount depending on the place, and you engage in peaceful protest, And the university says, nope, we don't allow you to say that. And so we rescind your right to be a student here, and we remove you from your living circumstances on campus. This moment. This happened with Columbia University yesterday and the day before. There were a number of students who lived on the street last night because a university to whom they had paid for residency threw them out, violating all kinds of things, and did it for a cultural appeasement. That's a wreckage of commitments on all sorts of directions. But commitment was not really discussed by the leadership of said university. It seemed to just act unilaterally, seemingly to appease social forces. And the result was, okay, I pay you money, but that doesn't matter. I pay for a room, that doesn't matter. I'm at a place that's supposed to develop independent thinking, that doesn't matter. I think that's egregious, and that's a large scale thing, but I think it's happening in a lot of smaller ways too.
Yeah. So, I think that all those things we just talked about demonstrate that the ontology and the ethics of commitment are almost inextricably intertwined, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that whether you consider it more an issue of ontology or ethics largely depends on your worldview, right? I think that Kierkegaard, who you mentioned earlier, would probably think it's primarily an issue of ethics rather than ontology. I think it all depends on, right, it's your commitment kind of comes back to your view on good and evil, right? If there was no people in the universe, right, does good and evil still exist, right? Or is good and evil an emergent property of human?
It's an emergent
living,
property
right?
of human, as far as we know, because we know of no other life form that expresses these things. So currently, contingently, it's limited to humans, yeah.
Right. So our idea, right, is that, okay, humans have developed over millions of years of evolution. They have developed language, the ability to communicate with each other, the ability to develop civilizations. And out of these sorts of things, commitment has developed as a social tool that facilitates functioning. The other story, right, and therefore commitment is an ontologically emergent property. The opposite story would be that there's a God that is not values neutral, right? There must be a God who is a force for good, who created the universe, created people, and then people are following an ethical norm, and therefore commitment emerges out of ethics rather than being. So, commitment, right, is as strange as it sounds, commitment probably accounts for a lot of the strife that we're currently experiencing in the modern world. Do you think?
Oh, yes. Yes, and I think we can go past what seems to be the superficial commitment to what people actually sometimes are really committed to, which is not the same thing that they say that they're committed to, because we know human beings are enormously conflicted.
Like an example I think of, right? So we talked about work last week. We've touched on some of the concepts this week. Mm-hmm. But if you want to think about, okay, well, why do boomers think about commitment to work differently than millennials or Gen Z people, right? And you mentioned Vietnam. But if you go back even further, right, to World War II or whatever, if you see the ideological tides that waged war in the 20th century, right, Nazis and against, the free world and these sorts of things, that's sort of just a violently present demonstration of very close to unconditional commitment, right? And how it can cause ugly features to emerge in humanity, and how an equally powerful commitment to other values was required in a worldwide war in order to make sure that some ideology didn't take over the globe, right?
So it
Do you think
so
that
it seemed.
So do you think that's something that has trickled down into generations' views of commitment? Do you think the younger people have maybe not experienced an event like that and therefore don't view commitment similarly, or do you think that's off base?
No, I don't buy into that capitalistically. I don't. Existentially, the current generation, I make that plural, current generations, are facing forces that, to me, don't diminish what seem to be happening in the world wars, but are certainly, to me, equal to it, even if they're not equal in amounts of military lives involved. The imminent collapse of ecology and climate, I would say it's undeniable, but people deny it because ontologically you'll decide what exists and what doesn't, because that's where all that starts. What are you committed to depends on what your ontological assessment is. If you believe in a god, then, or many gods, or whatever it is you believe in, that becomes part of your being, and your being is guided by that. All right, so yeah, no, the world is facing horrible things. The world wants to say the genocide doesn't occur anymore, and it does, and it is. The world wants to look away and say, well, we can just keep on doing what we're doing. It'll be okay. And all the signs point to it not. So I think this generation is as much as, if not more so, burdened by asking, in the time that I have to exist in this madness, what should my priorities be? I think they are more about commitment than other generations may have been.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I agree with you. Like,
I don't expect you to.
I think that the war. Well, I think that the warring ideologies, right, are probably at a similar level. Again, I wasn't alive in the 1940s. I don't know, right? So I'm just going off of historicity, right?
Yeah.
But I think that there is an ideological battle going on in politics, in epistemologies, and across human endeavors, right? Mm-hmm. That it feels like it has to be on a level of existential threat like we've never seen before.
I think it's on the level that Camus was writing about. Sartre was dark. Camus was darker. Albert Camus. So we have three responses to the absurdness of life. There's a lot of three stuff today, but that's right. We can ignore it and distract ourselves. And I think we see that happening with people. We all want to be distracted. No, don't. I just want to face it for a while. We can accept it and kill ourselves. Well, the world sucks. I'm done. Mm-hmm. I'm not making light at all of the idea of suicide. And Camus was not making light of the idea, but and it's certainly not recommended in circumstances that we're talking about, but it's there, and I understand why. And then there's the third, which is this is all of the absurdist philosophy compressed. Mm. The absurd human is the one who realizes the meaninglessness of life and continues to live anyway. And so in his book, The Stranger, he says, what really counted was the possibility of escape, a leap to freedom out of that implacable ritual of madness, a wild run for it that would give whatever chance for hope there was. Basically, this is a totally absurd place, but I'm going to live the best that I can within it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the current, your generation, the generation younger than you are dealing with. I don't think, I get so put off because I spent a lifetime working with young people. I saw generations, and each generation, no generation is categorizable.
Right.
To reduce it to a letter or whatever. And I know you know that. It appalls me sometimes that people will do that. Well, all X, this is logic, right?
Mm-hmm.
All X is Y. A is X, therefore A is Y. I mean, just to apply, it does, no. There's not a whole generation that are lazy. There's a whole generation that are making decisions that seem inexplicable sometimes to older generations, like not getting driver's licenses. On the surface, people, and I've been guilty of this until I try to think about what it is that I'm really saying, because it's just, well, it's an expectation. We do it. That doesn't make it right. That doesn't mean it's something we should be committed to. And some are doing that because they don't want to own a car. They don't want to have to contribute to pollution. They don't want to be in accidents. They don't want to be involved with machinery in that way. I think that's legitimate. And we don't respond by saying, well, let's have mass transit. We are not a culture that will commit itself to mass transit. No political ideology in this country has committed to a vastly important need because it doesn't want to be seen to be like Europe, or it seems to be reducible to those kind of things. And I think kids are saying, enough of this. And I say kids loosely, but I'm in my 60s, so I think there is a commitment to other priorities. That doesn't mean they don't work hard, but sometimes they work differently than the standard model, and then that can lead to disparagement. And I think that's not righteous.
Yeah, I think that's a really good explanation, because what I was going to say before you started talking, right, was that I think that the current generation is facing ideological differences and battles that are on the same level as previous generations.
Yeah.
But the comment I was going to make was that I don't know if the commitment to seeing it through is the same. But I think that you sort of highlighted how that is a bit of a tricky concept, right? And I think that, when you were talking about Camus, it's hard to parse apart, right? Especially if you're scrolling social media, who it just wants to be entertained and just forget it and put it out of their mind. What percentage of people are like that, and what percentage of people do want to make a difference, right? It's hard to grasp that from social media.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that if you look at social media, that's most of the message is like, hey, the world's a dumpster fire. Like, oh, well, what are you going to do about it? Let's just, keep scrolling. There's a lot of meme work that goes around that. But when you talk to people in real life, right, most people are committed to doing some kind of good, to doing some kind of work to make things better. So,
but what they determine as the good and how they determine that is up to them.
Yes. Right? And I think that's another important point, right? We're talking about warring ideologies. But I think that it's important to point out that ideologies are almost never the answer, right? Because that's the wholesale commitment, right? Like we were talking about before, the unconditional commitment to a certain set of ideas, when what history has shown us is that very rarely is there a set of ideas that's espoused by a group of people that is in its whole completely pure and absent of needing improvement, right? Or change or evolving over time.
This is why I have said many times, with no disrespect implied, that I am beyond fatigued hearing about the so-called greatest generation. Because it's not hard to look. Yes, people were conscripted. Some volunteered, some were drafted. to work against an ideology. But there was lots of more complicated stuff going on than that, including there's lots of stuff. And upon return, what that generation learned was deconstructed as rapidly as possible and conscripted to a vision, so that people who were treated as equals to some extent here and there in the military were right back to being discriminated against and killed back in their home country. And a vision of superseding that, creating the definite article, the, like one, American dream.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's what it's all about now. And now we have people realizing, I can't have what people had in the 1950s because that was a completely different time and we weren't aware of what was going on in the world. In fact, I don't want what people had in the 1950s. There are a lot of young people saying that. Well, whenever older people get rejection from younger people, they start getting all defensive. Well, you know what? The kids are right.
Yeah, if you think about it, right, World War II really didn't end when the war ended, right?
All of those war didn't end.
All of those people came home. It just became an economic war, right? We came home and it became, you have to buy stuff. You have to become a consumer in order to keep us above the rest of the world.
And consuming became the patriotic thing to do. You're not a good American unless you buy. You're not a good American unless you save. All right, there's a bipolarity that it's shifting into reverse by going into first gear, even though we talked last week about you can't shift anymore. What ideologically is that saying? You're bad if you spend money and you're really bad if you don't.
Yeah.
And by the way, we've only had about 10 years when there hasn't been a war that this country's been involved in.
Yeah, and if you don't, and if you don't think that was an economic war, right? You really, think about how the space race essentially corrupted the Soviet Union, right? Essentially, it worked. Like, we won the economic war, in quotes, right?
Yeah.
The problem is it's been carried on. It's almost an irreversible thing, right?
So when we go to a commitment and call it unconditional,
yeah, this leads,
what we're leading to.
Yeah, this leads me to my last question, right? Which is, how should we make decisions about what we should be committed to and for how long?
Well, this is where the difference is between those things we were talking about back at the beginning. A commitment versus a promise. We are not yet, in my view, committed. And I don't speak for you, it's just for me, but we are not yet universally, as a country, committed to the idea that all people are created equal, that they have inalienable rights, and that they get to make their own decisions for themselves. We clearly aren't committed to that. And so we haven't even come to terms with what our commitment was supposed to be unconditionally and how we violated that and continue to violate it. And I don't think we can get better until we take on the duty of facing that and make a promise to ourselves to do better.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, like what we've been talking about in the back half of the episode, is that the ontology and the ethics of commitment are so intertwined, right? That even if it is ontological, right? And when we think about, so what should we be committed to and for how long?
Yeah.
And if we relate it to our being, right? Okay, well, if commitment should be related to being, then we should at least give people the right to be, right? To live, right? To exist. And then as it's encapsulated in not only the Constitution, but by, philosophers before the Constitution was written, to life, to liberty, to the pursuit of happiness, right?
Yeah.
And we don't make it that far. And why don't we, right? I think that it's because what people's right to life and to freedom and to happiness is, gets all twisted up when you take an ethical approach to commitment versus an ontological one.
It does. Yes, you said that very well. And just as a nod to generational stuff, Aristotle took the position that change had to happen gradually in laws for a culture. Now, Aristotle was in a culture that wasn't equal and wasn't particularly seeking it, but still. But that idea of gradual change is one that seems less and less viable to a generation that's looking at 5, 10, 20 years, and quite probably the ocean current will stop. Oh, well, let's over the course of decades change our behavior, but we've got to do it slowly. So everybody, and they're saying that there may well not be time to do this slowly. So I understand that because that's not a lack of commitment. It's a commitment to a time frame that ontologically not everyone, for all the reasons, accepts. But I think if we recognize it takes work to recognize that somebody else's ontological vision isn't wrong just because it clashes with tradition.
Right. And also that, that people, part of an ontological view of commitment is that people are entitled to their ethical commitments, right? Even if they don't coincide with yours.
Yes.
Right? That's part of being committed to ontology, right? Having an ontological commitment is recognizing that people have rights to ethical commitments.
Lincoln recognized that we were not at our best if we all just agreed about everything.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, it's been good. Until next time, keep pondering.